Hello there, my name is Kent Mocha, your favorite teacher, and today, as you can see from the title, I'll talk to you about the main aspects of the democratic deficit in the EU. Now, before doing so, there are a couple of points we have to keep in mind. The first one is that when evaluating whether there is or isn't a democratic deficit, we have to keep in mind that that is a relative thing, because it depends with what other entity we compare the EU. And in order to make a proper evaluation on whether there is or isn't a democratic deficit, we have to compare the EU to a similar entity to it. And that, as you know, is a problem because there is no other entity similar to the EU. Because, as you know, the EU is a sui generis organization. It's not your typical public international organization, but it's not even a state. It's like something in between. So basically, in all the arguments that state that there is a democratic deficit, we are basically comparing the EU to a state, which is fundamentally not correct because it's not the correct comparison, basically. So we have to keep that in mind. The second thing we have to keep in mind is that in the EU, there is always a balance between the national states' interests and the EU interests as a whole. That's in every aspect in the EU works, in the treaty provisions, in the decision making, in the legislative acts, in the politics, in all of that. There is always this balance between the national states' interests and the EU interests as a whole. And in some aspects, the EU interest as a whole prevails over the national states' interests, and in other aspects, the contrary. The national states' interests prevail over the EU interests as a whole. And in almost all cases in which there is democratic deficit in this organization, it's basically a manifestation of the national states' interests prevailing over the EU interests as a whole. And that is a way to justify almost all of democratic deficit, basically, because there is always this balance that has to take place, right? So we have to keep that in mind as well. That being said, let's still jump into the main aspects of the democratic deficit. Now, the first aspect is that as you all know, the president of the commission is appointed, not directly elected from the people, from the citizens. And that is contrary to the way it works in the state level, where the heads of states or governments, they are always directly elected from the people. This doesn't happen in the equivalent of the government or the state in the EU level, which is the president of the commission, because he or she is appointed, not directly elected. And this is contrary to one of the fundamentals of democracy, where the direct election. So it's the direct manifestation of the will of the people in choosing their representative. So that is a democratic deficit right there. The second aspect of the democratic deficit is the fact that in the Council and in the European Parliament, the EU citizens are represented differently. Because in the council, the way it works is there is a voting system in which there is a minimum number of votes for the smallest states in terms of population, and the maximum number of votes disposal to a state in terms of population for the largest states. Let's just take the two extreme cases just to make it simpler: Germany, the largest state, and Malta, the smallest state. In the council, basically Maltese citizens are like 15 times or something better represented than the Germans. That is a democratic deficit. The same thing applies to the European Parliament, where the Maltese citizens are like 10 times better represented than the Germans, basically, because of the representation in the European Parliament through the MEPs. And that is also against a fundamental of the democracy, which is that every vote should have the same importance, right? Not like 10 times or 15 times more important the vote of one citizen in comparison to another, right? So a democratic deficit right there as well. Another thing is that despite its competences being increased more and more treaty after treaty, the European Parliament is still inferior to the Council. And even though almost all areas are now under the ordinary legislative procedure, there are still those very sensitive areas, like the common foreign policy and other areas, in which there is a special legislative procedure in which the Council takes decisions with unanimity, basically, and the European Parliament only has a consultative role. And even though there was an improvement regarding this from the ECJ in a case in which it stated that the giving of the opinion from the European Parliament should be given correctly. So if the opinion is not given correctly, the decision is invalid, basically. So that's an improvement, but it's not nearly as good as the ordinary legislative procedure, of course. In other treaty provisions, there is the European Parliament has kind of like a veto power. It either accepts or rejects the proposed legislative act. It cannot make amendments, which only the Council has that right, basically. That's a lot better, but it's still not the same as the ordinary legislative procedure, under which the European Parliament and the Council are on equal footing, basically. So we have to keep those things in mind as well. But the biggest competence that the European Parliament is lacking is exactly the right to initiate legislation, which is contrary to the way it works in the state level, in which even one MP can propose new legislative acts, let alone, for example, in the European Parliament. Okay, we are not saying that one MEP should be given the right to initiate legislative acts, but it could have been given, for example, 1/4 of the European Parliament, or 1/3, or a simple majority, or whatever. But not having this competence at all is a democratic deficit, because this competence to initiate legislative acts is strongly linked to the institution of the parliament in the national level. So not being the case in the EU level is, of course, a democratic deficit. And the same thing applies to the right of citizens to propose legislative acts. The EU citizens don't have this right, which is contrary to the way it works in the national level, in which a number of people can, if they get together, they can propose a new legislative act. However, the Lisbon Treaty, just like with the ordinary legislative procedure, even in this case, it gave a kind of proposal of legislative act to the European Parliament and to the citizens. So the European Parliament and also the at least 1 million EU citizens or residents from at least 7 member states, they can ask the Commission to propose a new legislative act to pass. However, the Commission in both cases can outright reject it as long as it gives an opinion. So that's better. That's a positive step towards giving those two entities this right, but it's not nearly as close as having a proper proposal of legislative acts. So that's a democratic deficit in that sense. And another aspect of democratic deficit is the fact that the national parliaments aren't nearly as much involved as they should be in the EU level, in the decision making and in the EU politics and stuff like that. And even though, again, with the Lisbon Treaty, there have been improvements specifically in order to reduce the democratic deficit in this regard, where the national parliaments were given, for example, the right to issue reasoned opinions, the reasoned opinions procedure, the yellow and the red card procedure, in which in which the national parliaments scrutinize the proposed legislative acts from the EU as being or not in accordance with the principle of subsidiarity, and if in a period of 8 weeks, if 1/3 of the national parliaments think that the proposed legislative act is not in accordance with the principle of subsidiarity, they issue reasoned opinions to the Commission, and if 1/3 of the national parliaments issue these reasoned opinions, then the Commission has to reevaluate its decision. It can either maintain the proposed legislative act or discard it. Whereas if a simple majority of the national parliaments are against it and issue reasoned opinions, then the Commission must reevaluate it, but also the Commission and the Council and the European Parliament, they both hold they take a decision upon this, in which if only a simple majority of either those institutions don't think it's in accordance with the proposed legislative act, isn't in accordance with the principle of subsidiarity, they outright reject it, and it's discarded. So that was obviously a good thing, but we can also state that even though this was an improvement, however, it could have been given, this competence could have been given in a better way to the national parliaments. For example, they could have been given a veto power. For example, if a simple majority of the national parliaments, which is very difficult to reach a simple majority, if a simple majority think that the proposed legislative act is not in accordance with the principle of subsidiarity, then the very fact that the simple majority would be against it, it would have been better if it would mean an outright rejection of the proposed legislative act, and not go through the procedure of being scrutinized under the European Parliament or the Council, basically. So we have to keep that in mind as well. But there have been also other improvements in terms of the involvement of the national parliaments. For example, they are involved in the treaty amendments, in the ordinary amendment of the treaty procedure, and in the special amendment of the treaty procedure. They are also involved in the general passerelle clause, which is basically making amendments to the treaties without formally amending the treaties, basically. And they are also involved in 5 of the 6 specific passerelle procedures. However, it has been stated from the German Constitutional Court that the national parliaments basically should have been involved more. Its involvement should have been more decisive in the general passerelle clause and in the 6 specific passerelle clauses, basically. So we have to keep that in mind as well. And also, the German Constitutional Court stated that the national parliaments should have also been involved in the flexibility procedure and in the emergency brake procedure, where they aren't involved at all. So it was pointed out from that court that is a democratic deficit right there in that regard. And the last main aspect of the democratic deficit is linked to the point I just made, which is that because of the fact that the national parliaments aren't involved as much, we are basically seeing in the EU level, let's say, we are seeing a shift from the legislative branch to the executive branch, basically, in the national level, because of the fact that the national parliaments aren't involved as much in the EU level, and because basically in the EU level it's only the governments partaking in the decision making. Basically, the national parliaments, so the legislative branch, is losing more and more power, basically, which is a democratic deficit in itself, because the national parliaments are the direct manifestation of the will of the people, or the representatives of the people, and the word democracy is strongly linked to the parliament, basically, and it losing more and more power, treaty after treaty, because the EU is always gaining more and more competencies, and in doing so, the legislative branch basically is weakened further and further more down the road, right? So the democratic deficit right there. And those were the main aspects of the democratic deficit. There are also secondary things. For example, it has been said that the EU is not that transparent also that the decision making in the EU is further away from the citizens than the national level decision making. Also that the EU institutions, they aren't as well understood. The way the EU works in general is not understood from the people as much as it is the way the national institutions work, basically. So those are some other things as well that we have to keep in mind, but those are all secondary things. Now let's do a recap, okay? So of the main aspects of democratic deficit. So first one, the fact that the president of the commission is appointed, not directly elected. Second, the not the equal representation of the citizens in the decision making in the voting system in the council and in the representation in the European Parliament. Third, the fact that the European Parliament is still weaker and less important than the Council, basically. Fourth, the fact that neither the European Parliament nor the EU citizens have a direct competence of proposing new legislative acts. And the last main aspect is both the fact that the national parliaments aren't involved as much in the decision making in the EU, and also the fact that we are seeing a shift from the power of the legislative branch to the executive branch, basically, in the national level. So those were the main aspects, and also the secondary aspects, that a lack of transparency, not being well understood from the people, and being further away from the people, the decision making, and so on. Okay, then those were the main aspects of the democratic deficit. We still have to keep in mind the 2 points I made in the beginning of this video, because I think that all of this democratic deficit is justifiable. Anyway, that was all I had to say. If I left anything unmentioned, if you want, leave it down in the comments below, and I guess I'll see you in the next video. Have a good day. Bye.